I am your host, Nero Wolfe. Let's begin our journey.
I was in the office, catching up on the bank balance and wondering if Fritz had enough time for the ragout when the doorbell rang. It wasn't the usual sort of ring. It didn't have the steady, purposeful thumb press of a man coming to pay a bill, nor the frantic tapping of someone in a hurry to get out of the rain. It was hesitant, almost apologetic. I glanced at the monitor. Standing on the stoop was a woman who looked like she had been assembled by an architect who specialized in sharp angles and expensive fabrics. She was holding a briefcase as if it contained a live grenade. "A customer," I remarked, leaning back in my swivel chair. Nero Wolfe didn't even look up from his book. He was currently immersed in a volume on the dietary habits of the Ottoman Empire. As far as he was concerned, the rest of the world could stop spinning until he reached the end of the chapter. His 1/7 of a ton of bulk was settled comfortably in the oversized chair behind his desk, a chair that had been specially reinforced to prevent a structural catastrophe. "No," Wolfe murmured, his eyes not moving from the page. "We are not taking clients. The bank balance is adequate for the month, and the Papio P. Delum seedlings require my afternoon attention." "The bank balance is adequate if we stop eating," I countered. "But since you recently expressed a desire for a specific vintage of Madeira that costs more than a used coup, I suggest you let me open the door. Besides, she looks like she's about to faint, and I'd hate to have to carry her inside. It's bad for my back." Wolfe made a sound between a grunt and a sigh noise he reserved for the various inconveniences of the human race. "Show her in. But if she is selling encyclopedias, I shall hold you personally responsible." I went to the front door, slid the bolt and opened it. Up close, she was even more high-strung. Her eyes were a restless grey, and her hands were gloved in silk that probably cost more than my first car. "Mr. Wolfe?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "I'm Archie Goodwin. Mr. Wolfe is inside, currently tolerating the existence of the outside world. Come on in." I led her into the office. She stopped 3 feet from Wolfe's desk, staring at him as if he were a monument that had unexpectedly started breathing. Wolfe didn't look up until she cleared her throat, a sound like a dry twig snapping. "Mr. Wolfe," she began, "my name is Elena Vance. I've come from the Blue Ridge Development Project. I was told you are the only man with the intellectual ruthlessness to handle a matter of absolute discretion." Wolfe closed his book, marking the place with a thin strip of gold-tooled leather. He looked at her, his lids heavy. "Ruthlessness is a tool, Miss Vance, not a temperament, and discretion is expensive. What has been disturbed? Your peace of mind or your ledger?" "Both," she said, finally sitting in the red leather chair I offered. She didn't lean back. "A set of strategic expansion plans for the Blue Ridge Hymens has been altered. Not stone-altered. It's a multi-million-dollar betrayal that involves land rights, environmental surveys, and a silent partnership that shouldn't exist. If the wrong people find out what was changed before I find out who changed it, the entire project collapses. And with it, several reputations." Wolfe's thick fingers drummed once on the desk. "He hates land development. He hates hills that aren't paved." But I saw the way his eyes lingered on the briefcase. "You mentioned a betrayal," Wolfe said, his voice dropping an octave into his investigative register. "That implies a personal connection. You do not come to me for a simple audit. The suspects are my 4 closest associates," she said, her voice trembling for the first time. "People I have known for 20 years. They are coming to New York tomorrow for the final signing. I want you to find the rot before they leave the city." Wolfe looked at me. I knew that look. It meant he had already calculated the price of the Madeira and decided he could endure a few days of strangers in the house. "Archie," Wolfe said, "it seems our afternoon is no longer our own. Miss Vance, tell me about these 4 associates, and please be precise. I have a profound distaste for vagueness." The following afternoon, the atmosphere in the brownstone felt like the inside of a pressure cooker waiting for the safety valve to blow. Wolfe had spent the morning actively resenting the fact that he had taken the case. He bullied Fritz over the precise consistency of a béarnaise sauce, snapped at me for typing too loudly, and spent an extra 20 minutes in the plant rooms just to prove he couldn't be hurried. By 2:30, he was anchored behind his desk, glaring at the empty yellow chairs as if they were personal insults. I was at my own desk, pretending to audit petty cash but actually watching the monitor. At exactly 2:45, 3 town cars pulled up to the curb. Our sanctuary was officially under siege. The invading army has arrived, I announced, swiveling toward him. 4 suspects and 1 very nervous client. Should I check them for weapons or just bruised egos? Wolfe merely flattened his palms on the desktop, a microscopic tightening of his jaw being the only acknowledgement. I took my time walking to the front door. I slid the chain through the bolt and pulled it wide. Our client stood on the stoop, looking even more brittle than yesterday, flanked by 2 men and 2 women who radiated the kind of restless, high-voltage energy that usually requires a lightning rod. They didn't look like criminals. They looked like people used to walking into boardrooms and expecting everyone else to stand up. I ushered them down the hall and into the office. The room instantly felt smaller. It wasn't just the physical bodies, it was the sheer volume of their impatience. She made the introductions, her voice tight and defensive. The tall man with silver hair and a jawline carved out of granite was Arthur Sterling, the chief architect. The woman pacing near the globe, wearing a sharp navy suit and a permanent scowl, was Diana Cross, the financial director. The younger guy, checking his expensive watch every 12 seconds, was Marcus Red, head of acquisitions. Finally, there was Silas Thorne, the legal counsel, a graying man who looked like he had been born wearing a 3-piece suit. He took the red leather chair immediately, resting his hands on his cane, his eyes darting around the room, assessing the books, the globe, and finally, the immovable mountain behind the desk. Wolfe did not stand. He did not offer his hand. He merely sat, vast and absolute, letting the silence stretch. It is a trick of his, a way of letting the air out of people who are used to inflating a room. For a full minute, the only sound was the ticking of the wall clock and the faint hum of the city outside. The tension began to thicken, wrapping around the furniture like an invisible fog. Diana Cross stopped pacing and crossed her arms defensively. Marcus Red stopped checking his watch and stared at Wolfe, his foot tapping a restless rhythm on the rug. Sterling cleared his throat, a low rumble of impending authority. They were used to being in charge, and Wolfe's total lack of reaction was deeply unnerving to them. I sat at my desk, my notebook open, a pen twirling between my fingers, thoroughly enjoying the show. "Mr. Wolfe," Sterling finally barked, unable to endure the vacuum any longer. "Our colleague tells us that you have been retained to investigate a supposed breach of our proprietary data. Let me be perfectly clear. This is an internal matter. It should be handled by corporate security, not a private operator in a He glanced around the opulent, meticulously arranged room, searching for an insult and failing to find one. In a residential townhouse, we have a flight tomorrow, and I do not intend to waste my afternoon entertaining amateur theatricals." Wolfe slowly turned his head, his eyes half closed, fixed on Sterling with the dispassionate weight of a falling safe. When he spoke, his voice was smooth, quiet, and utterly final. "Mr. Sterling, your intentions are irrelevant to my investigation. You are here because a deceit has occurred, and a deceit is an infection. You may take a seat, or you may stand and tie your legs, but you will not raise your voice in this room again." Sterling opened his mouth, then closed it. He sat in one of the yellow chairs. The others exchanged guarded, uneasy glances. The dynamic had shifted instantly. They had walked in as a unified front of corporate power, but Wolfe's immovable certainty had cracked the ice. Now, they were just 4 suspects, realizing exactly how much trouble they were in. Wolfe leaned back in his custom-built chair, closed his eyes, and let his chin sink into his chest. To a stranger, he looked like a remarkably large man taking a mid-afternoon nap. To me, it meant he was working, and to the 5 people in the office, it was a masterclass in psychological torture. For 3 long minutes, the only sounds were the ticking of the wall clock and the agitated breathing of executives who weren't used to waiting. I spent the time studying their shoes. Sterling wore bench-made Oxfords that had never seen a puddle. Reed favored Italian loafers, soft and impractical. Cross wore lethal-looking heels, and Thorne had sensible brogues. You can tell a lot about how a person expects the world to treat them by what they put on their feet. Diana Cross finally broke, her high-heeled shoe snapping against the rug. Are we here to hold a séance, or are we going to discuss the problem? Wolfe's eyes opened a fraction of an inch. We are going to discuss the opportunity, Ms. Cross. Miss Vance has informed me that the structural and environmental surveys for the Highland Tract were subtly altered. A river setback was reduced. A zoning limitation was removed. The resulting paperwork, if signed tomorrow, would legally bind your consortium to a catastrophic environmental violation, bankrupting the project and allowing a rival buyer to purchase the land for a fraction of its value. Which is exactly why this is absurd, Arthur Sterling muttered, his volume noticeably lower than before. None of us would sabotage our own project. We've spent 5 years on this. Someone did, Silas Thorne said. The lawyer hadn't moved from his position, his hands still stacked on the head of his cane. His voice was smooth, like expensive bourbon, but there was a sharp edge to it. And whoever did it needed access to the secure digital vault. Only the 5 of us have the encryption keys. Ergo, one of us is a traitor. Marcus read. The acquisitions man let out a short, humorless laugh. He dragged a hand through his carefully styled hair. Don't play the wise elder, Silas. If the zoning fails, the original landowners default, and the mineral rights revert to the holding company. A holding company your brother-in-law happens to manage. Thorne didn't blink, but his knuckles went white on his cane. That is a baseless, slanderous implication, Marcus. I have dedicated my career to the integrity of this firm. Is it? Diana Cross snapped, turning her hostility entirely on the lawyer. You've been dragging your feet on the compliance filings for weeks. I had to threaten to hire outside counsel just to get you to sign the escrow release. My caution was due to the volatility of the interest rates. Diana, Thorne shot back smoothly. Perhaps if your ledgers were cleaner, I wouldn't need to scrutinize every single comma. I sat at my desk, my notebook open, sketching a little diagram of arrows pointing between the suspects. Everyone was aiming at everyone else. It was a beautiful, functional circle of greed and paranoia. The tension was thick enough to carve. And what about you, Marcus? Elena Vance suddenly said, her voice shaking but angry. You were the one who pushed to include the Eastern Ridge in the purchase. If the project goes under, the Eastern Ridge is the only parcel that retains its commercial value. You could scoop it up independently and freeze us out. I pushed for it because it made geographic sense. Reed stood up, his face flushing a dangerous shade of red. I'm the one who negotiated the rights. You're just trying to cover your own tracks, Elena. You're the one who noticed the alterations. How convenient that you get to play the whistleblower while framing the rest of us. Enough, Wolfe commanded. The word wasn't shouted, but it dropped into the room like a lead weight. Red froze, then slowly sat back, adjusting his cuffs. Wolfe shifted his bulk, surveying the shattered remains of their professional courtesy. You have all beautifully demonstrated my point. You are bound by mutual suspicion and shared opportunity. Each of you has the access, expertise, and motive to carry out this betrayal. It is a highly competent piece of sabotage. Wolfe tapped a finger against the arm of his chair. I now know the shape of your animosities. Tomorrow morning, you are scheduled to sign the final contracts. You will delay that signing by 24 hours. Impossible, Sterling barked. The sellers will walk. Then let them walk, Wolfe said coldly. If you sign, you commit corporate suicide. You will delay the signing. You will remain in New York. Archie, show them out. At 9 o'clock the next morning, Wolfe was upstairs in the plant rooms, artificially pollinating orchids, and I was on the pavement, earning my salary. The 4 suspects and our client had taken rooms at the Churchill, a hotel that catered to people who thought $100 was an acceptable price for room service eggs. Wolfe's instructions had been maddeningly vague. Observe their friction, Archie, he had rumbled before stepping into the elevator. People forced to wait will inevitably agitate the water. I started my patrol in the lobby, positioned behind a copy of the Times with a clear view of the elevators. At 10:15, Marcus Red came down. The acquisitions man looked less put together than yesterday. His tie was loose, and he carried a leather folio tucked tightly under his arm. He made a beeline for the revolving doors. I gave him a half-block lead and followed. He walked briskly, cutting across Midtown with aggressive strides. He ducked into a heavily marbled office building on Madison Avenue. I checked the lobby directory. The top floor belonged to Cromwell Hayes, a firm specializing in independent geological surveys. Why would the man in charge of buying land visit an independent surveyor on the exact day he was supposed to sign a finalized contract? I made a mental note and parked myself across the street. 40 minutes later, Red emerged, looking pale. He practically sprinted to a cab. I let him go. I had a bigger fish to fry back at the hotel. Returning to Churchill, I didn't have to wait long. Arthur Sterling and Diana Cross were seated in a secluded alcove of the lounge, unaware that their hushed, venomous argument was broadcasting straight to my trained ears from the adjacent booth. "You are overreacting," Arthur Cross hissed, stirring her coffee violently. "The delay changes nothing. Wolfe is a dinosaur. He sits in a chair and issues threats. He has no proof. He doesn't need proof yet, Diana. He needs leverage," Sterling shot back. "If he looks closely at the escrow accounts, he'll see the transfer you authorized last month. You swore that money was replaced. It was allocated, not stolen," she snapped. "And if you hadn't botched the setback permits, I wouldn't have had to grease the zoning board in the first place. We both know you altered the architectural models to hide the drainage flaw. If the buyers find out, we go to prison." I sipped my own coffee. So, the chief architect was covering up a physical flaw in the land, and the financial director was playing fast and loose with escrow to bribe officials. It was a beautiful symphony of corporate fraud, but it wasn't our specific sabotage. They were hiding their own messes, which made them terrified of Wolfe's spotlight, but it didn't mean they altered the secure files to tank the deal. I slipped out before they finished their mutually assured destruction and headed for the business center. I was looking for Silas Thorne, and I found him exactly where a lawyer shouldn't be, at a public computer terminal. He typed methodically, his cane leaning against the desk. I approached from his blind side, stepping softly on the plush carpet. Before I got close enough to read the screen, he minimized the window with a sharp click of the mouse. He turned his face to an unreadable mask. "Mr. Goodwin," Thorne said smoothly, taking a break from shadowing my colleagues. "Just stretching my legs, Mr. Thorne," I replied, flashing an innocent grin. Drafting a new contract or trying to figure out how to void the old one? Thorne took up his cane. "Neither. I was just catching up on the news. You can tell your employer his intimidation tactics will not yield a confession. We are professionals, not frightened children." He walked past me, his gait perfectly measured. But as he left, I glanced at the wastebasket beside the terminal. Sitting on top of discarded receipts was a crumpled piece of heavy, watermarked paper. I fished it out and smoothed it open. It was a printed flight itinerary. Silas Thorne, the man preaching corporate unity, had booked a one-way, first-class ticket to Geneva for that very evening. I folded the paper, slid it into my breast pocket, and smiled. The water wasn't just agitated, it was boiling. It was time to go home and tell Wolfe, our patient, sensible lawyer, was preparing to jump ship. I returned to the brownstone at 6 o'clock, the flight itinerary to Geneva burning a hole in my pocket. The house was quiet, which usually meant Fritz was prepping something complicated in the kitchen, and Wolfe was still in the plant rooms. I went straight to the kitchen to see if I could snag a cracker and some of the sharp cheddar Fritz keeps for emergencies. Fritz was there, but he wasn't cooking. He was standing by the spice rack, looking as though he'd just witnessed a minor blasphemy. He didn't even turn when I entered. "Archie," he said, his voice hushed and hollow, "look at the tarragon." I looked. The spice jars, which Fritz keeps in an order so precise it would make a librarian weep, were skewed. The tarragon was sitting 2 inches to the left of where it belonged, and the lid was cross-threaded. For anyone else, it was a minor kitchen mishap. In this house, it was the equivalent of a pipe bomb in the mailbox. I moved past him into the office, my hand instinctively going toward my desk drawer where Marley lived. The room looked undisturbed at a glance, but once you live with a man who notices the displacement of a single molecule, you pick up the habit. The middle drawer of Wolfe's desk was open a fraction of an inch, not even the width of a nickel. Wolfe never leaves that drawer open. I crossed the room and looked inside. The file for the Blue Ridge Highlands, which I had placed there myself before leaving for the Churchill, was slightly angled. I didn't touch it. I went to the house phone and buzzed the plant rooms. "Yes?" Wolfe's voice came through the line, sounding like a disgruntled bear. "We've had a visitor," I said. "A very quiet one. Someone with a key or a very talented set of lockpicks. They played with the spices and took a peek at the Blue Ridge file. The line went silent for 3 seconds. Then the click of the elevator starting its descent echoed through the house. When Wolfe left, he didn't look at me. He walked straight to his desk, stared at the drawer, and then looked at the spice rack through the open kitchen door. He didn't explode. He didn't even puff his cheeks. He simply sat down, his movements slow and deliberate, and placed his hands flat on the blotter. The sanctity of this house, Wolfe said, his voice a low, vibrating hum, is not a suggestion. It is a requirement for my existence. To enter uninvited, to touch my property, to disturb the arrangement of Fritz's kitchen, it is an act of profound insolence. Not to mention a felony, I added, sitting at my desk. I checked the front door. No scratches on the plate. Whoever it was had a key. Elena Vance has a key, which she gave us yesterday to facilitate deliveries. I assume she has a spare, or one of her loyal associates made a wax impression while she wasn't looking. Wolfe ignored me. He was staring at the air 3 feet in front of him. Did they take anything? Not that I can see. They were looking for something specific, probably the geological survey results we don't actually have yet. Or maybe they were trying to plant something. I've already checked the underside of the desk and the chair for microphones. It's clean. They did not come to listen, Archie. They came to verify. Wolfe's eyes sharpened. They wanted to see if I had discovered the specific nature of the alteration. The tarragon was a mistake of hastier person, unfamiliar with the geography of that kitchen, trying to find a place to hide while Fritz moved from the pantry. So we have a stowaway, I said. Which of our 4 friends do you think is nimble enough to dodge Fritz and pick a file? Reed is fast, but he was at Cromwell and Hayes. Sterling and Cross were busy plotting over coffee. That leaves Thorne, who was at the business centre, or Elena herself. Wolfe's finger tapped the descants twice. The identity of the intruder is a secondary concern. The primary fact is that they are now terrified. They have realized that I am not merely an obstacle, but a predator. They have violated the one rule I do not forgive. He looked at me then, and for the first time in years, I saw a flicker of genuine cold fury in his eyes. It wasn't the usual irritation over a missed meal or a wilted orchid. This was a man whose fortress had been breached. Call Saul Panzer, Wolfe commanded. I want him here within the hour. And Archie, check the basement. If they touch the water heater, I shall lose my temper. I stood up, adjusting my holster. If you lose your temper, the foundation might crack. I'll go check the pipes. But you might want to look at this first. I pulled the Geneva itinerary from my pocket and dropped it on his desk. Wolfe didn't even pick it up. He just looked at it and sighed. Mr. Thorne is a pessimist, Wolfe remarked. He thinks there is a corner of the world where I cannot find him. He is mistaken. Saul Panzer arrived at 7:40, looking, as usual, like a man who had just finished a long shift at a hobby shop and was looking for a quiet place to have a sandwich. He wore a cap that had seen better decades and a jacket that didn't quite match his trousers. But Saul is the only man I know who can find a needle in a haystack and then tell you the serial number on the needle. I let him in, and he gave me a quick nod before heading straight to Wolfe's desk. Wolfe greeted him with as much warmth as he ever shows, which is to say he didn't grumble about the interruption. Saul, Wolfe said, I require a shadow that does not cast a reflection. Mr. Thorne is planning a journey to Switzerland. He must not board that plane. However, he is not the only one in motion. I need you to coordinate with Ori and Fred. I want a 4-way watch on the Churchill. If any of our guests leaves the hotel with more than a briefcase, I want to know within 30 seconds. You think they are all going to bolt, Mr. Wolfe? Saul asked, his eyes sharp and attentive. No, Wolfe replied, only the one who feels the floorboards beginning to give way. But as Archie has discovered, the rot is more widespread than we anticipated. One is bribing, one is concealing structural flaws, and one is fleeing. It is a festival of malfeasance. I need to know who returns to the brownstone tonight, because they will return, Saul. The intruder left something behind or failed to find what they sought. They will be compelled to finish the job. Saul nodded, took the list of names and descriptions I had prepared, and slipped out the back way. The house settled into a thick, expectant silence. Wolfe refused to eat dinner in the dining room. a move so rare it was practically a national emergency. Instead, he had Fritz bring a tray to the office. He sat there, tearing off pieces of bread with a mechanical precision that told me his mind was already 3 moves ahead of the suspects. Around 11, the pressure moved from inside the house to the sidewalk. I was watching the monitor when a dark sedan pulled up. It wasn't one of the hotel town cars. A figure stepped out, bundled in a heavy coat despite the mild evening air. They didn't walk to the stoop. They stood across the street, just under the shadow of a street lamp that had flickered out earlier in the evening. I tapped the screen. "We have a spectator," I said. "He's been there for 10 minutes, just watching the windows." Wolfe didn't look up from his beer, described the posture Archie, dingsy, shoulders hunched. He keeps reaching into his pocket not for a phone, but like he's checking for a set of keys or a heavy object. It's Marcus Red. I recognize the shoes. He's deciding whether or not to double down on his mistake. "He will stay there," Wolfe murmured. "He is the weakest of the 4. He lacks the arrogance of Sterling and the icy detachment of Thorn. He is currently weighing the probability of my being asleep against the certainty of his own ruin." But Red didn't move toward the door. Instead, another car pulled Yupra yellow cab this time. Diana Cross stepped out. She didn't see Reed in the shadows. She walked straight to our door and pressed the bell. I looked at Wolfe. He nodded once. I went to the door, kept the chain on and peered out. "It's late for a social call, Miss Cross," I said. "I need to speak to Wolfe," she hissed, her face pale under the porch light. "The hotel is being watched. I saw a man in a cap following Silas. We're being hunted, aren't we? Not just looking for a file thief. You're looking for a sacrificial lamb." "Mr. Wolfe doesn't make sacrifices," I told her. "He does logic. If you've got something to add to the pot, come on in." I let her in, but as I was closing the door, I saw Red step out of the shadows across the street. He looked at the brownstone, then at the cab that was pulling away. He turned and started walking toward 10th Avenue, his pace increasing until he was almost running. He wasn't coming in. He was braking. I led Diana Cross into the office. She stood in the middle of the rug, looking at the desk where the Blue Ridge file sat, still slightly askew. She gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. "It's gone," she whispered, "the geological addendum. If you have that, then you know." "I know many things, Ms. Cross," Wolfe said, his voice cold and steady. "I know about the escrow transfers. I know of bribed zoning officials. But what I am interested in is why you were trembling. Are you afraid of me, or are you afraid of what happens when the others realize you've come here to negotiate your own surrender?" She didn't answer. She just stared at the file, her eyes wide with a terror that hadn't been there yesterday. The pressure was no longer just a feeling, it was a physical weight in the room, and the first crack in the dam had finally appeared. The clock on Wolfe's desk chimed midnight, a thin silver sound that seemed to slice through the heavy tension Diana Cross had brought into the room. She was still standing, her knuckles white as she gripped the back of the yellow chair. Wolfe hadn't invited her to sit. He was busy pouring a glass of beer with the kind of concentration most men reserve for surgery. He waited for the foam to settle to a perfect half-inch before he looked at her. The silence was a tactical choice. He was letting her own fear do the heavy lifting. "Ms. Cross," Wolfe said, his voice as smooth as the head on his brew, "you speak of a geological addendum. You talk about it like it's a death warrant. Yet, when I examined the files Miss Vance provided, there was no such document. There was merely a gap in the pagination ghost where a report should have been. You have just confirmed its existence. That was an error of judgment on your part, though a predictable one. I didn't come here to play word games." She snapped, though the bravado was leaking out of her like air from a punctured tire. "Marcus is falling apart. Sterling is ready to throw us all under the bus to save his architectural firm. And Silas has already checked out. If that report gets into the hands of the state investigators, we aren't just looking at a failed deal. We're looking at a RICO indictment. I want to know what your price is to keep that specific folder out of the official record." Wolfe's eyes went shut. "My price is the truth you cannot afford. Archie, get Saul on the line." I picked up the phone and dialed the private number. Saul answered on the first ring. I handed the receiver to Wolfe, who didn't hold it to his ear but left it on the cradle, using the speaker. "Report, Saul," Wolfe commanded. Thorne is at the Churchill bar. Saul's gravelly voice filled the office. He's not drinking, he's waiting. He just received a courier deliver a small, padded envelope. He didn't open it. He put it straight into his inside breast pocket. Also, Ori reports that Arthur Sterling just left the hotel through the service entrance. He's headed toward the east side. He's got a briefcase chained to his wrist, Mr. Wolfe. He looks like a man who's afraid of his own shadow. Thank you, Saul. Continue the observation. If Mr. Sterling meets anyone, identify them. If Mr. Thorne moves toward a terminal, intercept him. Wolfe cut the connection with a flick of his finger. He turned his gaze back to Diana Cross, who looked as though she might faint. You see, Ms. Cross, the circle is closing. While you are here attempting to bribe me, Mr. Thorne is receiving the fruits of his blackmail, and Mr. Sterling is likely attempting to sell the very evidence you fear to the highest bidder. You are all remarkably busy for a group of people who claim to be partners. Blackmail? Diana whispered. Silas wouldn't. He's the one who drafted the partnership agreements. Precisely, Wolfe murmured, which gave him the perfect vantage point to see where the bodies were buried. He didn't alter the files to tank the deal, he altered them to create a lever. He wanted to ensure that each of you was so compromised that you would have no choice but to facilitate his exit with a significant portion of the development's liquid assets. Wolfe shifted his weight, the springs of his chair protesting. Archie, it is time to stop the clock. Call Miss Vance. Tell her I require the presence of all parties in this office at 9 o'clock tomorrow morning. Tell her that if any of them fail to appear, I shall turn the contents of my desk drawer over to Inspector Kramer of the New York Police Department. I believe the mention of the missing tarragon will be enough to ensure their punctuality. Tarragon? Diana asked, her confusion momentarily overriding her terror. A private matter of domestic security, Wolfe said coldly. Archie, show Ms. Cross to the door. She has a great deal of thinking to do before breakfast, and I have a book to finish. The dietary habits of the Ottomans are far more logical than the maneuvers of modern executives. I escorted her out. She didn't say a word as I opened the door. The night air was cool, and the street was empty now. Marcus Red had vanished into the city. I locked the door, slid the bolt, and walked back into the office. Wolfe was already back in his book, the beer glass empty. You think they'll all show? I asked. They have no choice, Wolfe said without looking up. Their own spinning web ties them together. If one pulls away, the whole thing collapses. They will come, Archie, and they will bring the missing pieces with them. The next morning, the office felt like a courtroom where the judge had already decided on the sentence but was waiting for the court reporter to finish his coffee. Fritz had brought in the extra folding chairs, arranging them in a semicircle facing Wolfe's desk. By 8:50, the air was thick with the smell of expensive tobacco and cheap desperation. Elena Vance sat in the front, her eyes red-rimmed, looking like she had spent the night staring at a wall. The others filed in like they were approaching a gallows. Arthur Sterling was first, his jaw set in a grim line, followed by a twitchy Marcus Reed and a visibly shaken Diana Cross. Silas Thorne entered last, his cane tapping a rhythmic funeral beat on the parquet floor. He looked at Wolfe with a cold, professional curiosity, as if he were admiring the construction of his own trap. Wolfe waited until the clock struck 9 before he moved. He didn't rise, of course, but he straightened his spine, which in that chair was the equivalent of a king mounting a throne. He let his gaze travel slowly from left to right, lingering on each of them just long enough to make them shift in their seats. I sat at my desk, my notebook open and my fountain pen poised. I had already checked the drawers. The Blue Ridge file was exactly where it belonged, and the office was sealed tight. Commonly, Wolfe began, his voice resonant and chillingly calm. The disruption of a business venture is a matter of simple greed. One person wants more than their share, so they reach into the till. But what we have here is a far more intricate tapestry of failure. You four have spent years building a facade of corporate excellence, yet underneath, the foundation is made of sand and secrets. You came to New York to sign a contract that was, in reality, a suicide pact. Someone in this room realized that the project was doomed by its own hidden flaws and decided that if the ship was going to sink, they would be the only one with a lifeboat. This is all very dramatic, Mr. Wolfe. Silas Thorne interrupted, leaning his chin on his hands atop his cane. But unless you have more than metaphors, we have a flight to catch. You mentioned an official record to Ms. Cross. I assume you are referring to the Geological Survey. If you have it, produce it. If not, stop wasting our time. Wolfe's eyes sharpened. I do not have the survey, Mr. Thorne. I have something much more damaging. I have a motive for disappearing. Mr. Sterling, you altered the architectural models because you knew the eastern ridge was unstable. You hoped to pass the liability to the insurance carriers after the first rainfall. Ms. Cross, you diverted escrow funds to cover personal trading losses, expecting to replenish them once the deal closed. And Mr. Reed, you were prepared to sell out your partners to a rival firm for a finder's fee that would have left them in the cold. You are all remarkably consistent in your lack of character. A chorus of denials erupted, but Wolfe raised a single, fleshy hand and the room went silent. The authority in that gesture was absolute. However, Wolfe continued, none of you possessed the specific combination of cold-bloodedness and legal foresight to execute the digital sabotage. To alter the master files required not just access, but a deep understanding of the partnership's liability clauses. It required someone who could ensure that when the project failed, the blame would fall squarely on the shoulders of the others, leaving one person legally shielded and financially enriched. Someone who, for instance, has already secured a first-class ticket to a country with very favorable extradition laws. Every head turned towards Silas Thorne. The lawyer didn't flinch. He merely smiled, a thin, wintry expression that didn't reach his eyes. A travel itinerary is not a confession of sabotage, Wolfe. It's a sign of a man who knows when a partnership has turned toxic. Indeed, Wolfe murmured. But the padded envelope you received at the Churchill bar last night, one you placed in your breast pocket, is a different matter entirely. You see, Mr. Thorne, I know what was in that envelope. You didn't just steal a file. You stole the leverage that would have kept your colleagues silent. You thought you had the only copy of the true geological report, and you were prepared to use it to extort your exit. But you made a grave error. You underestimated the sanctity of my home. Wolfe leaned forward, his bulk casting a massive shadow across the desk. You were the one who entered this house last night. You were the one who disturbed the tarragon in the kitchen while attempting to hide from my chef. And in your haste to verify that I hadn't found the original data, you left behind a trace of your presence that is far more incriminating than a fingerprint. The room was so quiet I could hear Marcus Reed's watch ticking. Thorne's grip on his cane tightened, and for the first time, a flicker of genuine uncertainty crossed his face. The game of nerves had reached its peak, and Wolfe was holding all the cards. Thorne's composure finally began to liquefy, a slow melting of the wax mask he had worn since entering the brownstone. He shifted his weight, and the heavy silver head of his cane let out a dull thud against the rug. Wolfe watched him with the detached interest of a biologist observing a specimen under a slide. The rest of the room remained frozen. Even Sterling had stopped blustering, realizing that the lawyer's silence was more damning than any shouted accusation. You speak of traces, Wolfe, Thorne said, his voice regaining its oily sheen. But you are a man of logic, or so you claim. A misplaced spice jar in a kitchen I have never entered is not evidence. It is a domestic triviality. If you intend to call the police, do so. Otherwise, I find this posturing tiresome. Posturing is for those with weak hands, Mr. Thorne, Wolfe replied, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous rumble. I do not require the police to prove your presence. I only need basic laws of botany and the specialized knowledge of my plant rooms. You see, when you entered this house, you did not merely traverse the hallway. In your attempt to find a vantage point to observe the office without being seen, you retreated through the dining room and brushed against a tray of Cypripedium seedlings I had prepared for transport. Those particular orchids carry a very specific, adhesive pollenon that is invisible to the naked eye, but glows with a distinct ultraviolet frequency under the correct light. Wolfe gestured toward me. I reached into my desk drawer and pulled out the handheld UV lamp I use for checking watermarks. I didn't even have to stand. I clicked it and swept the beam across the room. As the violet light hit the cuff of Thorne's left sleeve and the lower hem of his trousers, a series of brilliant, glowing yellow specks jumped into life. It looked like Head walked through a cloud of radioactive fairy dust. That pollen was only in the dining room between the hours of 6 and 8 last night, Wolfe said. It is not found in hotels, or in town cars, or in the offices of land developers. It is found here. You were in this house, Mr. Thorne. You were in my kitchen, and you were at my desk." Thorne stared at his glowing cuff as if it were a limb that no longer belonged to him. The shock was so total that he didn't even try to hide his arm. Diana Cross let out a sharp, jagged gasp. Elena Vance stood up, her face white with a mixture of betrayal and relief. "You stole the geological report," Elena said, her voice trembling. "You wanted to hold it over us. You were going to let the project fail, let us all go to prison for the environmental violations, and then sell the clean data to the rival group in Switzerland. You weren't just protecting yourself, Silas. You were the one who made the alterations in the first place to ensure the project would collapse at your command." "A masterful deduction, Miss Vance," Wolfe remarked. Mr. Thorne realized that a successful project would yield him only a legal fee. A spectacular, controlled failure, however, would yield him millions in a secondary sale of the land's true potential. He didn't just sabotage a file, he attempted to sabotage 4 lives. "The padded envelope in your pocket, Mr. Thorne, contains the original Savith one you removed from the digital vault and replaced with the forgery. You couldn't resist keeping the physical evidence. It was your insurance policy." Thorne looked around the room, the cold fury in Sterling's eyes, the disgust on Reed's face, and the absolute immovable weight of Nero Wolfe behind the desk. He reached into his breast pocket, his fingers trembling slightly, and pulled out the envelope. He didn't hand it to Wolfe. He dropped it on the floor as if it had turned red hot. "It doesn't matter," Thorne whispered, his voice cracking. "The deal is dead anyway. None of you can sign now. I've ruined you all." "On the contrary," Wolfe said, a ghost of a smile touching his lips. "By exposing your fraud, I have provided Miss Vance with the legal grounds to void any agreements you touched. The project will survive, though its leadership will be significant, pruned. Archie, take the envelope. Mr. Thorne, you will remain here until Inspector Kramer arrives. I believe the charge of breaking and entering will provide the necessary hook for the more substantial crimes that will follow." Wolfe leaned back, the tension leaving his frame as he regained his customary posture of repose. He had won. Not through a chase, not through a brawl, but through the simple, inescapable application of pressure and the glowing dust of a rare orchid. The betrayal that had shocked Blue Ridge had been unraveled in a brownstone on West 35th Street. All it had cost was a slightly misplaced jar of tarragon. By the time the last of the Blue Ridge contingent had been escorted out, Thorne in the custody of a very grumbling Inspector Kramer, and the others in a state of shell-shocked mutual loathing, the afternoon sun was slanted across the office floor in long, amber bars. The silence that followed was not merely the absence of noise, it was the heavy, satisfied quiet of a house that had successfully purged itself of an infection. Fritz was already in the kitchen, and the rhythmic, muffled chopping of shallows served as a comforting metronome for the returning order. I spent 20 minutes returning the yellow chairs to their proper alignment and wiping the UV-sensitive pollen off the floorboards, though I made sure to leave a few specks on the dining room rug just to see if Fritz would notice them during the morning cleaning. Wolfe had not moved. He remained behind his desk, staring with a glazed intensity at a small framed photograph of a cattleya that hung on the far wall. To an outsider, he might have looked exhausted. To me, he looked like a man who was debating whether the mental exertion of the last 48 hours justified an extra helping of the braised sweetbreads Fritz had promised for dinner. I sat at my desk and began the tedious process of filing the notes and locking the geological report, real whodunit, the wall safe, until Elena Vance's lawyers could collect it on Monday. The case was closed, the betrayal was documented, and the sanctity of the brownstone had been restored, albeit at the cost of my shoe leather and Wolfe's patience. "You know," I said, leaning back in my chair and stretching my arms until my joints popped, "Thorne really was the best of the bunch. If he hadn't been so greedy, he probably could have run that whole development into the ground without anyone being the wiser. It was the tarragon that did him in. That, and the fact that he didn't realize you don't just walk into this house and start poking through the furniture. People have tried to bomb us, shoot us and sue us, but nobody gets away with messing with the spice rack." Wolfe shifted his eyes toward me, the heavy lids barely flickering. Mr. Thorne's error was not one of geography, Archie, but of vanity. He believed his intellectual superiority made him invisible. He viewed the others as static obstacles and viewed me as a stationary relic. It is a common failing of the modern executive to mistake physical stillness for mental stagnation. He assumed that because I do not chase suspects through the streets, I am incapable of intercepting them. Well, you intercepted him all right, I said, grinning. And you got your Madeira money. I expect the bank balance is looking a lot more than just adequate now. We might even be able to afford that new cooling system for the orchid rooms before the summer humidity hits. We shall see, Wolfe murmured, his voice softening as the first aromas of dinner began to drift through the doorway. The pursuit of justice is a noble endeavor, but it is rarely as rewarding as a properly executed sauce. Mr. Thorne's betrayal was not merely a crime against his partners, it was a crime against the social contract. He sought to thrive on the wreckage of others' ambitions. Such a man is a predator in a suit, and the world is better served when they are caged. And the orchids? I asked. Are they going to recover from being used as a forensic trap? I'd hate to think we sacrificed a prize-winning seedling just to catch a lawyer. Wolfe actually shuddered, a motion that caused his entire bulk to ripple like a disturbed pond. The Cypripedium are resilient, Archie. Unlike the human character, they do not hold a grudge. They require only light, water, and a lack of interference from individuals with padded envelopes and bad intentions. The dinner gong sounded a low, melodic note that signaled the end of the professional day and the beginning of the only time Wolfe truly considers sacred. He pushed himself back from the desk, his movements deliberate and majestic. He stood for a moment, adjusting his waistcoat and ensuring that the world was exactly as it should be. "Come, Archie," he said, turning toward the dining room. "The day has been long, the company has been tedious, and I believe Fritz has outdone himself with the Gruyere tart. Let us leave the geography of Blue Ridge to the surveyors and focus on the geography of the plate. It is a far more reliable terrain." I followed him, catching one last glimpse of the office in the twilight. The desk was clear, the chairs were empty, and the house was once again a fortress. As we walked toward the dining room, I couldn't help but think that while Wolfe might be a stationary relic, he was the only one I knew who could move the world without ever leaving his chair. It was a good thing to remember, especially the next time I felt like complaining about the filing. After all, in a world full of thorns and sterlings, someone has to keep the tarragon in its place.